Hello and welcome to the Starting Out webinar that's going to focus on inquiry-based learning. My name is Gaynor Sharp and I have a background in science education, in schools, at university and as a PGCE tutor. The objectives of the session are to explain the advantages, as I see them, of inquiry-based learning approaches, and the webinar will begin with looking at science practical as it is now and then continue to lead into a discussion about inquiry-based learning. Whilst we're going through the webinar, I'd like you to think about this starter question. Is there a difference between how science works and how school science works? And I'd like you to hold that in your head as you're going through this debate. There's a lot of opinions that people have about education in schools and particularly school science, and I'm sure we're all aware of the way practical work is seen and quite often done in school science laboratories. There's a lot of science that really doesn't challenge, engage, excite, interest and inspire youngsters, and very often it isn't anything like real science at all. One student in some research a few years ago actually suggests that they didn't like the way school science was done, following a recipe, not knowing what the correct answer was, or perhaps not getting what they thought would be the correct answer, and quite often, as I'm sure you've experienced, asking the teacher for the right answer. This is how a lot of science goes on in schools at present. A lot of people think authentic or real inquiry is about discovery learning and that young children are naturally curious and interested. I think all people are naturally curious, interested in exploring and finding out new things to them. But is finding out new things to you real science as we see it? Ofsted has a view on practical work in science, and we have been talking about practical work in the previous few slides, that science teachers have such a lot of information, and whether or not the students are developing a real understanding of what all that information's about, I'm not sure, but I do believe that inquiry leads to a better understanding. So I want to talk now about what an authentic inquiry is, what a real inquiry is, and the ways in which it can be used in school science. There's an approach to doing inquiries with learners of all ages actually, and there are four major facets. There's a starter activity, a stimulus, some questions and debate, followed by a period of reflection. So I'm going to look at these in turn in a little bit more detail. It's important that the starter activity focuses on the content of the inquiry. Very often when I observe in science classrooms, we'll see a starter activity that's nothing to do with the learning that's expected to go on that lesson. I think it's really important in inquiry-based learning that the youngsters are actually thinking and focusing right from the minute they come through the door on the particular topic they're going to be studying for that lesson. Important too to ask youngsters for reasons for their thinking, the reasons behind their thinking, to develop their reasoning skills. And the topic in an inquiry-based learning activity is one where there's not a simple yes or no answer. For example, does sugar dissolve faster in hot water or cold water? An investigation that's been going on for years. The stimulus needs to be engaging, it needs to be interesting, it needs to have scientific ideas. It could be a newspaper article. Some newspaper articles do have some science in them. It should also provide some contrary views, for example, the nuclear power debate that's very in the news at the moment. When students actually have contrary views presented to them in this manner, they actually begin to clarify their own thinking process, and this is good scientific thinking. The students, while they've while they were listening or participating or reading the stimulus material, would have been asked to think about what was interesting to them, what was curious, what was unusual about the stimulus, so that they were beginning to focus on the real key issues associated with the stimulus. And after they've studied the stimulus, they will sit either individually or in groups of 2 and 3 and start to generate their own questions. And this own question is really important. Teachers often come into classrooms and ask 2 or 3 questions, put 2 or 3 questions on the board and wait for the students to answer. Students soon learn, as many of my students probably did too, that the teacher knows the answer and they'll give the answer, so you don't really have to think, you can have a bit of a rest. When students generate their own question, they're much more likely to want to find out some answers or to explore further answers, which is very fundamental to inquiry-based learning. So once they've got a question, as I say, individually or working with their peers, they give the questions to the teacher. The teacher will write them up on a board or on an overhead transparency or the whiteboard or whatever. And then the students actually vote for those questions. First of all, if there's any lack of clarity in the questions or anything they don't understand about the questions, they ask the originators to provide that clarification. And they vote. They can do multi-votes, they can do single votes, blind votes, and they choose the question they want to inquire into more, the one that interests and inspires their thinking. Then they'll go in to discuss the question, and the person that originated the question, the person to first come up with the idea, actually starts the discussion, will actually provide a background to their thinking, where they came up with the question, where the ideas came from. Was it in the stimulus? Was it beyond the stimulus in experiences they'd had beyond? The teacher doesn't direct the discussion, the pupils direct the discussion, and the teacher guides, asking for examples and clarification, maybe counter-examples. Very good scientific process, asking pupils to give a counter-example to the point they're trying to argue for. When the discussion has come to an end, it's important to go on to a period of reflection. It's really important that the students share their thoughts about the activity after having individual time to think about it themselves, then talk to others about it. And quite often, some things that some students have focused on have not been thought about by other students, and this is a period where the learning continues through this reflection process. The benefits of this approach: students have ownership of the topic. They're asking their own questions, they're debating the answers to their own questions too. So they have interest, they have enthusiasm, they're engaged in it. Students are developing these important scientific skills, reasoning, questioning, discussion, as well as many others, such as observation, for example. An inquiry-based classroom tends to be a non-threatening learning environment where students are confident to share their ideas, because there isn't a right or a wrong answer, and as long as they can justify what they're saying, everything is acceptable. And finally, one of the major benefits of an inquiry-based approach is that students finish the session with more questions to ask about the topic rather than simply a correct answer. So hopefully the inquiry-based approach will prove enjoyable and interesting to you and your students. If you're all enjoying learning will be more effective. So I hope you've enjoyed the webinar today, and please don't forget to look at the activities associated with this. There's a whole inquiry that you can follow verbatim. Thank you very much for your time.